Today, I'd like to tell you the story of my father, Wilfred Oliver McLean. He was born in Edmonton, and his oldest sibling, Marjorie, my aunt, told me when she was about 9 years old, her mother said to her one autumn morning, "Marjorie, please go to the fort and get the nurse to come here as soon as she can." The fort referred to is Fort Edmonton, located at that time on the grounds of what's now the legislature. And of course, the fort itself, or a version of it, has been relocated to where we go, to Fort Edmonton. The McLeans lived on what is now 107th Avenue and about 105th Street, a few blocks from where Fort Edmonton was then located. The day was Monday, October 26, 1908. My Aunt Marjorie followed her mother's instructions, went to Fort Edmonton, requested the nurse, who came home with her and attended to her mother. Later that day, a baby boy arrived into the McLean household, the fourth boy in a family that also went on to include two more girls, a family of 7 children. October 26, 1908 was also the day of a Canadian federal election, with Wilfrid Laurier, the Prime Minister of the day, winning a majority. If the baby was to have been a boy, his name was going to be Donald. However, my grandparents, being staunch, dyed-in-the-wool Liberals, were delighted with the election victory and their new son. So they named him Wilfrid, after the newly elected Prime Minister. That was my father. His second name, Oliver, was after my grandparents' friend, Frank Oliver, the owner of the Edmonton Bulletin at the time, and a cabinet minister in the federal government. That little boy, Wilfrid, grew up in Edmonton, and the family then lived on Nelson Avenue. The home was no longer there. It's about 30 years ago it was demolished. Now this is an area of shops, restaurants, etc. in that part of Edmonton. When Wilfrid was about 6 years old, his father built a brand new home, and the address was 11231 95 A Street. That house is still there and is still someone's home. So I often drive by because that is where I used to visit my grandparents. Norwood School is just a couple of blocks south on 95 A Street. The school was built the same year my father was born, 1908, and was opened the next year in February 1909. It was a very modern school for the times, designed by architect Roland Lines and built in classical revival style. This brick school replaced 2 smaller wooden frame structures that had served the community since 1906. The cost to complete the school was $89,000, with modern amenities such as an electric school bell, individual student desks, and water fountains. It was truly a landmark for the new city of Edmonton, and at the time was the most modern and expensive school in the new city of Edmonton, and actually in Alberta. Wilfrid went to Norwood School for a number of years, and after all those years ago, today Norwood School is still a thriving school located on 95 A Street on 111th Avenue here in Edmonton. It continues to play an important role in the community where it is located. In an Edmonton Journal article, my father recalled the era when Edmonton schoolboys dressed in uniforms, and in the Edmonton Public School Board, boys from ages 12 to 19 were given rifle target and bayonet practice, and military drill and parade marching. The Edmonton Public School Board Cadet Corps ran in Edmonton schools from 1907 to 1932 to give Canada's youth some military training to defend our country. In my Caustic's historical book, A Century in 10, there's a description of the school cadet movement, which was to prepare young Canadian men to defend Canada and her British traditions. My father, a grade 6 student at Norwood School in 1920, stood 54 inches tall, only 3 inches taller than his 11-pound .303 Ross Army rifle, which he shouldered in military squad drills. I was on the school board for a number of years. I never knew about that, though I read it in the book. Well, the family lived in Edmonton. My grandfather was a building contractor and also had an interest in farming. Relatives of the family were also farmers, with farms in Mayo, north and east of Edmonton, also in the Stony Plain area west of Edmonton. The young Wilfred spent many hours at the various farms. One year, the whole family moved temporarily to Nemeo to look after a relative's farm, and Wilfred and his siblings attended school in Nemeo for that year. During his early teen years, Wilfred became a paper boy for the 2 Edmonton newspapers, the Edmonton Bulletin and the Edmonton Journal. He told me when he was age 12, the Journal gave their paper boys a membership in the downtown Edmonton YMCA. He was thrilled with that and spent as much time as he could doing a wide variety of sports, including swimming, wrestling, boxing, basketball, and handball. He was an accomplished athlete, and we have trophies that he won for those various sports that we still keep. He still had a Y membership and continued swimming well into his 90s at the Y. When he was 90 years old, the YMCA celebrated him by making him a lifetime member after over 70 years of continuous membership. He said at the time he valued his Y membership, not only for the opportunity to exercise, play a wide range of sports, and engage in many athletic endeavors. The Y had nurtured decades of lifelong friendships and also provided other lifelong learning activities, such as public speaking and leadership skills. During his teen years, Wilfred also at times went to help on the farms of his father, grandfather, and other relatives. In reading his stories, it seemed he attended school in those communities at times as well. He finished grade 11 at Victoria High School at age 17 and decided not to do grade 12. He enrolled in Camrose Normal School and graduated from there in 1927 with a second-class teaching certificate. At that time, there was no faculty of education at the U of A, and the 2 Alberta normal schools were in Camrose and Calgary. The building still stands at the Augustana campus of the U of A in Camrose and is being used today. My father enjoyed his stay there and made lifetime friendships with other students. He was a good basketball player, and in the yearbook of 1926-27, which I have, the team picture shows him as a player, the captain, and the coach. Wilfred attended the U of A and received a degree in arts from the Faculty of Arts, and then a master's degree and part of his PhD from the same faculty. He was interested in pursuing his PhD, but that was not available at the time at the U of A. As this was the Depression of the 1930s, it was not possible for him to attend, as the place he would have had to go was the University of Chicago. I want to tell you a bit more about my father, the teacher. As we know, he was one of 7 children. 5 of those children became teachers, a remarkable number. We think about teachers and their importance in our lives. We can probably all remember that first day we went to school and the excitement and the thrill of meeting new and old friends, and the important part of the day when we got to find out who the new teacher was. I wondered what it must be like to be a first-time teacher in a school. Wilfred's first teaching job was in a rural school in 1927. He was 18 years old. He was equipped with grade 11 education and a second-class teaching certificate. His first school was named Fruitland, and he taught grades 1 to 8. His salary was $920 for the whole year. His second school was White Whale School and was in the Mawassan district of Stony Plain. He taught grades 1 to 11 and received a salary of $1,200 for the year. He said the courses were pretty well outlined in the curriculum guide. The problem, he said, was to find time to teach them all. Not surprising, as he was teaching 11 grades. It is interesting to note that Hugh McLean, Wilfred's father, was involved in the building of that White Whale School in the year 1903, 5 years before my father was born. At this time, Wadman Lake was called White Whale Lake until 1906. There is still a creek called White Whale Creek, which goes from Lake Wadman into the North Saskatchewan River, just south of where this school was. At this time, most new teachers were required to serve an apprenticeship in rural schools before the Edmonton Public School Board would even consider hiring them. In 1933, Wilfred acquired a teaching position in Edmonton Public Schools. His first school was Riverdale, which is still an Edmonton school. He said the principal was excellent, Mr. Livingstone. My father taught social studies and mathematics to grades 7 and 8 students, which was quite different from his earlier experiences. He said teaching was a bit different in those days. Some schools were quite formal. Students would be marched into the classroom. He said there were almost no disciplinary problems. The students were always well behaved. There were not a lot of resources, and concentration was placed on teaching students how to read, write, and understand mathematics. He liked having spelling bees and contests in arithmetic. He used to try these out sometimes with his own children. I'm not sure if we were very cooperative. In those days, parents were not around the schools very much. He said occasionally a parent may want some information about their child, but this seldom happened. He said it was very rewarding to teach students. Over the years, he experienced students coming up to him at various events and saying how much it meant to them to take a course he had taught, such as the history of English literature. They said it gave them a background they could build on in later years. On a number of occasions, I've had people come up and tell me that they were taught by my father, and they have expressed the same gratitude for having had him as a teacher. Some of the subjects he taught included mathematics, social studies, English literature, and French. He said, as a teacher, your greatest accomplishment is helping students learn to read and write well, to be able to do mathematics, to teach them about history and its importance, cultivating their interest in literature, helping them learn about the world, all the things they will need later in life. For over 40 years, Wilfred had a career with Edmonton Public Schools, teaching in a number of schools, including West Glen, East Glen, Victoria, and he opened Harry Ainley, and these were all high schools. He served as vice principal when Harry Ainley was opened, and he later became the principal of Harry Ainley. When he turned 90, the Edmonton Public School Board recognized his extensive contributions to education and the accomplishment of turning 90 with a special celebration. District staff interviewed him and recorded his memories of his early teaching experience, and they paid tribute to him as an exemplary educator who touched the lives of thousands of students and helped shape the course of the Edmonton Public School Board. Soon after the Second World War started, my father decided to take a leave of absence from teaching to sign up for military service with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was a flight lieutenant. He traveled to a number of places in Canada for training, and my mother's sister and I traveled to live in two of those places, Winnipeg and Dauphin, cities in Manitoba. It was while we were living in Winnipeg, my father received the news he was going to be sent overseas to the war. My mother and her two daughters returned to Edmonton by train. I have a recollection of that trip. It was very long. While we had a home in Edmonton, we were not allowed to return to it because it had been rented to an American Army man and his family. As housing in Edmonton was very scarce, we lived with my mother's family, my grandparents, the Holes. They very generously took in our family, and we lived there until the war was over. My father returned, and we moved back to our home on 97th Street. Living with my grandparents was an exciting time, as some of my mother's siblings were still living at home, some in high school, and some attending the U of A. It was a very busy place. People didn't speak much about the war, and it was rather challenging as a young child to figure out or try to what was happening. We did get letters from my father, but unlike today's world of opportunities such as email, texting, etc., to communicate with others in faraway places, those things were just not available during the 1940s. There were airmail letters my father regularly sent. There were no such things as telephone calls or any other means of communication. As a young child, I remember listening to speeches by Prime Minister Mackenzie King and Winston Churchill. When we lived in my grandparents' home, the radio was in the kitchen, and we were told that we must pay attention with absolutely no talking aloud when these broadcasts were on. As a young child, I often wondered what the war was all about. These events, such as listening to Prime Minister Churchill, were obviously extremely important. I remember going to watch the parades with my father leading the troops and all the pageantry of that. I remember going to meet him at the train station when he came home on leave. And I also remember the day the war ended, VE Day. However, there was not much explanation to a 5-year-old about what was really going on. My father did not speak very much about his experiences during the war. I do remember him saying one of his jobs was to release German prisoners of war. He was in Holland, Germany, England, and Denmark. After he returned from the war service, he went back to teaching. Through a federal government program for returning veterans, my father was able to purchase a 50-acre parcel of land, which was then in the country, is now located in Edmonton, 34th Street and about 95th Avenue, which is the industrial heart of our city. My father was a farmer at heart, so he was able to do hobby farming and teaching. The land that he purchased had a wonderful 2-story brick house, and my mother insisted before we could move there, the home needed electricity, running water, and she relented to have a coal furnace. That didn't last very long, as 2 months after we moved to the country, oil was discovered at Leduc in February 1947, and that changed Alberta forever. 8 pipelines were built through my father's land, which was a nightmare to experience. And eventually the area became too industrialized for my parents and our family. The land bordering on the north was occupied by a steel mill and what used to be a bucolic rural setting with cows pasturing in the field turned into a used car lot and steel manufacturing going on 24 hours. Just a few months ago, I heard there was a very large fire at an industrial site on 34th Street, which is where we lived in Strathcona County. We moved to a 3-acre property near Sherwood Park in 1957 called Halbert Crescent, with my father turning a construction office and warehouse into our home. He was able to have wonderful gardens and lawns until the land was expropriated for road construction. By then, the children had left home, had gone on to university, and had their own homes and families. And my parents moved into an Edmonton condominium overlooking the North Saskatchewan River. They lived a very busy and full life. My mother returned to teaching when she was 55 and taught for 12 more years. Following their retirements from teaching, they traveled the world and shared wonderful times with friends and family. They enjoyed a wide circle of lifelong friends. These people got together frequently. Special occasions were held to mark major events, and these often included a program of activities, sometimes with games and contests and music. And my father often contributed a poem written for the event. My father did extensive research on both his and my mother's families. They made a number of trips to Prince Edward Island, where the records he was able to access of his mother's relatives and their experiences of coming to Canada as a result of the Scottish land clearances were amazing. Such things as passenger lists of ships that brought ancestors from Scotland in the 1850s, wedding certificates of family members, baptismal records, death certificates, etc. My father later purchased a farm in the county of Stony Plain, adjacent to the property where White Willow School had been located and where his first years of teaching happened. People in that farming community remembered my father. Some of them remembered him being their teacher. My father passed away at age 91, and my mother died at the age of 101, lives well lived. These children of pioneers had strong values. They worked hard. Education was extremely important. Schools were built early in their communities. Their spiritual and religious lives were important to them. Churches and religious places of worship were built early in the community's development. They looked out for their neighbors. Their word was their bond. They had strong loyalty to family and friends, and they made time for fun and celebration. My father was a strong man, physically and mentally. He was very resourceful and had a wide range of interest. His family was very important to him, and education was extremely important in our family. They were hard-working, visionary people. We, as the descendants of these people, are the inheritors and the beneficiaries of their hard work and dedication. We are privileged to share the legacy they have left us. I will tell you then about the story of an early Edmonton pioneer, Hugh McLean. He was my father's father, my grandfather. He came to this part of the world in the 1890s. He was born in Ontario in 1871 near Guelph in a town called Wellington. His parents had come to Canada from the Isle of Skye in Scotland during the Scottish land clearances about the year 1850, when landowners removed people off the land. I said they scraped people off the land and put them into boats, which ended up going to Canada, in my family's case, and others went to places such as far off Australia. Hugh McLean's family ended up in Ontario. The Scottish landowners back in Scotland wanted to use the land for grazing sheep, as wool garments had become a hot commodity and a fashion item. And these removed people were farmers, and they were called crofters. In Ontario, my grandfather became a bridge builder and a carpenter and had a job working on building bridges for the under construction Canadian Railway. In his mid-20s, he left Ontario and headed west to seek adventure and new experiences. At the time, there was no railway to Edmonton, so he worked on building bridges that preceded the actual railway construction. He called himself a carpenter. He ended up in Edmonton, where he settled. Here he met Christiane McKinley, whose family had also come from the same area in Scotland, the Isle of Skye, although their ship had landed in Prince Edward Island when it came to Canada. Hugh and Christiane married in Edmonton in 1898 at the First Presbyterian Church, which was originally located on 99th Avenue across from the current Mackay Avenue School, which was then Mackay Avenue School. And the First Presbyterian Church is just down the street now. They became a family of 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. 5 of their children became teachers. One son worked in the insurance business, and the other worked his whole life for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Hugh had a farm in the Stony Plain area, a few miles south of Stony Plain, some of the best farmland in the world, although during the summers of 1899, 1900 and 1901, hailstorms swept through Stony Plain, St. Albert, and east of Edmonton. He was hailed out 3 years in a row. The last time, in 1901, he was driving his binder out to the field to start cutting his crop, and the hail began. And within a few minutes, his entire crop was gone. As a result of this, he gave up his farm and moved into Edmonton, where he went into the contracting business. He later purchased a farm in the Cowling area, some miles to the north, although the family never lived again on the farm. They lived in the city. Hugh McLean also built homes, schools, and churches. He was involved in building the first school west of Edmonton, the first church west of Edmonton, and one of the first schools his son Wilfred taught in the country west of Edmonton called Mewalson, which I mentioned earlier. Hugh also worked on building our legislative buildings that we have to this day. And during the construction of those buildings, my grandfather was involved in acquiring the stone for those buildings. And this was a major undertaking, and it was necessary for him to move to the site of the quarry, which was near Calgary, and it was going to be an extended period where they were going to get all the stone for the legislature. All the family moved to this area near Calgary, and they set up living quarters. We actually visited it. It's a historic site, and it's kind of interesting. They had schools there and stores, and it was, but not long after they did this move, it was determined that the sandstone from this quarry was not sturdy enough to be the stone for the legislature. So all the project workers had to return to Edmonton, but because housing in Edmonton was very scarce and my grandparents had leased their home, my grandfather went back to Edmonton for his work, which was now back in Edmonton. And Christiane and all the children had to stay at this quarry site near Calgary. I was told it was many months. It was quite a harrowing experience for my grandmother, who had all these little kids, and she was looking after them. They were running all over the place. I heard a few stories from my oldest aunt about those activities, and I think her being the oldest girl, probably a lot of responsibility fell on her shoulders. But my grandmother never talked about these things. Unfortunately, I didn't know enough to ask her, because I'm sure there was stories. I think one day one of the boys broke 2 bones, one in his leg and one in his arm. It's important to underscore the significance of Canadian patriotism in the early 1900s. My grandfather Hugh was one of those patriots. Western Canada had suffered a severe business depression in 1913 and 1914. The 1913 wheat crop was way below average, and this was a major source of wealth. There was high unemployment. Canadians flocked to join the armed forces, leaving many Western Canadian towns and villages depopulated of able-bodied men. Those in the Canadian Corps came from every walk of Canadian life. These Canadians had to learn to fight under the most difficult conditions. On July 1st, 1915, at the age of 44, Hugh MacLean enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in Edmonton. He was a member of the 3rd Division, the 7th Infantry Brigade, the 49th Battalion. At the time of his enlistment, the rate of pay for a private in the Canadian Army was $1 per day, with a field allowance of 10 cents per day. A battalion consisted of approximately 1,000 men. After 11 months of extensive training, probably in Quebec, he sailed on May 1st, 1916 for England, spent May in England, and transferred to the 49th Battalion on June 6, 1916, and landed in France 2 days later. He was taken on strength, they called it, June 11th, 1916, when the 49th Battalion had suffered devastating losses at Mount Sorrel. The Canadians suffered 8,000 casualties, with the 3rd Division suffering the heaviest losses. Life in the trenches was extremely unpleasant. Soldiers could not keep warm and they could not keep clean. Endless days and weeks saw soldiers crouched behind their rifles in soaking wet uniforms. Often the water and mud came above their knees. Lice crawled and rats swarmed everywhere. Illness was prevalent in the trenches, and the continual wetness caused a painful condition known as trench foot, similar to frostbite, and if neglected, could lead to gangrene. Soldiers on the front lines were ordered to remove their boots and puttees. Puttees were a 10-centimeter wide strip of cloth wound spirally about the leg from knee to ankle. At least once every 24 hours, the feet and legs would be dried, rubbed, and greased with whale oil, and dry socks put on if available. Propaganda back home was that soldiers got to eat the very best and most substantial food, and plenty of it, listing meat, bacon, fish, sausages, daily baked bread from Canadian flour, butter, jam, tea, coffee, cheese, sugar, pickles, potatoes, fresh or dried vegetables. The reality was not anything close to this propaganda. The 49th Battalion fought in the following battles during the time of Hugh MacLean's service: Mount Sorrel, the Somme in 1916, Flers Courcelette, Ancre Heights, Arras, 1917, and Vimy Ridge, 1917. All these battles were in France. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Hugh was severely injured. The story told to me was after the battle, Hugh's captain ran out on the battlefield and dragged him off. My father told me he was a boy of 8. When the doorbell rang at their home in Edmonton, when he answered it, the telegraph boy asked for his mother. My father called her and she came to the door. The telegraph boy handed her a telegram stating, "Private Hugh MacLean is missing in action, presumed deceased." I asked my father if he remembered what his mother did, and he said she took the baby and went upstairs. 2.5 weeks later, his mother was informed that Hugh MacLean was alive and in a hospital in France. He apparently also recuperated in the home of a very kind and caring French family. Vimy Ridge was tactically one of the most important features on the entire Western Front. Canadians arrived in front of the ridge in December 1916, and raids by the Canadians began on December 20th until the end of February 1917, and which was the opening of the battle, which was the evening of April 8, 1917. Hugh McLean fought on the battlefields of Vimy Ridge. While he had not recovered from his wounds at the Battle of the Somme, his military service was still needed. And amazingly, even though he had not fully recovered from his injuries at the Battle of the Somme, he was sent to participate in the battles at Vimy Ridge, which he did, and where he was wounded again. I was told that at Vimy Ridge he was shot in the temple. Hugh McLean was officially discharged from the Army October 31st, 1917, and returned to Edmonton. He was not ever able to work again as a carpenter, contractor, and suffered from his war injuries for the rest of his life. When he was 60 years old, he was told he had 2 years to live. He beat those odds and passed away in 1956 at the age of 88 years. The trauma of World War I for those who served is hard for us to imagine. So many lost their lives, so many suffered from more wounds and injuries for years after. Their lives and the lives of all those families whose members served were never the same. Conditions now known as post-traumatic stress syndrome were unknown to that era of medicine, and people were not always properly treated, leading to great suffering for many. Burned out soldiers was a term used. So many people made the supreme sacrifice so that we are able to live in a land of peace. My father's younger sister, Jean, she told me she was very young. I think she was 6 when her father went to war. She said when he returned, he never seemed the same. She told me about him bringing special necklaces home for his 3 daughters and how special that was for her. I remember my grandfather being very quiet. He used to take us out to the backyard and tell us about his garden. And I do not recall him ever telling us any stories of the war. The reality of those left behind at home, it's not talked about very much. For Hugh's family, he left behind his wife, Christiane, and 6 children. 2 months later, after he left on September 14, 2014, after Hugh's departure from Canada, a 3rd daughter was born, Mary, completing their family of 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. And also prior to Hugh's leaving for the war effort, a brand new home had been built by him for his family on 95A Street and 112th Avenue, which one, unfortunately was not quite finished when he left for the war. So he told Christy and his wife that he had arranged for someone to finish the house and she could move into it when that was done. So not only did she have the 7th child, she had to move them all into a house. Anyway, that house, as I mentioned, is still standing and is still a family home in the Norwood neighborhood just down the street from Norwood School. The sacrifices women made are often not spoken about much when discussing the horrors of World War I or II. The commitment by all those who went to war was an incredible sacrifice. And the sacrifices by those left at home were also very significant. My grandmother was an unsung heroine and an amazing woman to endure such tribulations. My grandparents remained steadfastly patriotic, even though the war had taken its toll on Hugh McLean's physical and mental health, and the absence of him from their Edmonton home must have been extremely challenging for him, my grandmother, and indeed all their family. I remember my parents always making certain to vote, and they would get all dressed up to go and vote. It was their civic duty. There's a picture of my grandparents on the day of the royal visit of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to Edmonton, and I think that was 1939. I wasn't around then. My grandfather is wearing some of his army uniform, and he has his war medals adorning his suit jacket, and my grandmother is dressed up in a suit with her hat to go and see the king and queen. I recall friends and relatives coming to visit my grandparents and realizing how important those visits were to them. Often some of those people would be soldiers who had served with my grandfather. On their 50th wedding anniversary, I went with my father to celebrate this special event. On that same day, our family, which consisted then of my parents, of course, and my sister and me, we were celebrating the arrival of my first of two brothers. So my oldest brother was born on the day of my grandparents' 50th anniversary. So it's a very celebratory event. I found it strange that my father was handing out cigars to all the men in the room and was passing around boxes of chocolates. My grandparents went on to celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary. And there's a photo and a story in the Edmonton newspaper, which was a common thing in those days. These early Edmonton pioneers were resilient people with strong values. Family was extremely important. They looked after their neighbors. They overcame incredible obstacles at times to provide for their families. Education was paramount, and many sacrifices were made so children could attend school and were encouraged to go into trades and services, to go to college and universities. And we are grateful for the wonderful legacy they leave us.